Adeline Foster was mucking out the north stall when she heard a rider come up the lane, unhurried, the particular pace of a man in no rush to prove anything to anyone. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the yard to find a stranger dismounting, tall and lean, dressed plain, a battered hat pulled low against the Nebraska sun. He introduced himself simply as Jesse Dunmore, said he'd heard she was hiring for Roundup, and asked whether she still needed hands willing to work for fair wages and a bunk in the barn loft. Adeline looked him over the practical way she looked over every stranger who came asking for work that spring, judging strength and steadiness rather than manners. "Roundup starts in 4 days," she said. "Pays modest, but it's honest. You'll eat what I eat and sleep where the other hands sleep." "Suits me fine," Jesse said, and that was the whole of it. No further questions, no complaints about the terms. She hired him on the spot, the way she'd hired 3 other drifting hands that week, and thought no more of him than she thought of any capable stranger willing to work cattle for wages. What she did not yet understand was that the quiet man now unloading his bedroll in her barn loft held more say over the fate of her ranch than any single person in the Nebraska Territory, herself included. Cedar Fork, in the spring of 1883, sat at the edge of good grazing country that had, in recent years, drawn considerably more attention from land speculators and railroad surveyors than the valley's ranching families entirely welcomed. Adeline had inherited the Foster ranch 2 years earlier when her father's heart finally gave out after 30 years of building it from nothing, and had spent those 2 years learning, by hard necessity, everything he had never quite finished teaching her about running 11,000 acres alone. She was 28 that spring, unmarried by circumstance rather than choice, having spent her 20s helping her father run the ranch rather than courting the kind of attention that might have taken her elsewhere. Her mother had died when Adeline was young, leaving her father to raise her largely alone, and he had taught her everything a rancher needed to know without ever once suggesting the lessons mattered less because she was his daughter rather than a son. She had done well enough, all things considered, keeping the herd healthy and the fences sound, but the previous winter had been hard on cattle prices across the territory, and the note her father had taken out years before to expand the herd now sat considerably heavier on her books than it once had. The Cedar Fork Cattle Bank held that note, and its local manager, a precise, unsmiling man named Franklin Meade, had begun making pointed visits that spring, each one carrying a fresh reminder that the balance would need settling in full come autumn, regardless of what the Roundup actually brought in. Adeline had gone to Meade's office twice already that spring, asking for reasonable time, explaining plainly that a fair Roundup would cover the debt if cattle prices held steady, and Meade had listened with the particular patience of a man who had already decided the conversation's outcome before it began. He mentioned, each time, that the bank's regional office in Omaha set the true terms on notes this size, and that his own hands, regrettably, were largely tied by policies handed down from considerably higher up the ladder than his own desk. Jesse Dunmore worked the Roundup those first days with a competence that surprised Adeline more than she let show, reading cattle and terrain with the particular ease of a man who had done this work for years rather than weeks. He said little beyond what the work required, ate his meals without complaint, and treated the other hands with an easy respect that made him well liked within the first 2 days despite his quiet manner. He rose before the other hands most mornings, checking the horses and the tack before anyone else stirred, and worked through the heat of each afternoon without ever once asking for a pace easier than what the Roundup actually demanded. Adeline noticed, watching him from a distance more than once, that he never gave orders to the other hands despite clearly understanding cattle work at a level well beyond an ordinary drifter, choosing instead to simply do his own share and let his example speak for itself. Without quite naming it to herself, the small, carefully bound tally book he kept in his coat pocket, filling it most evenings with notes she assumed were simply a private habit, weather observations or personal accounts, the sort of thing a careful drifter might keep to track his own wages across different outfits. She did not ask him about it directly, understanding that a hired hand's private habits were generally his own business. It was Otis Grady, her longest-serving hand, who first said something that struck her as slightly odd. "Dunmore rides like a man who's owned land himself once," Otis said, watching Jesse work a difficult heifer back toward the herd with unhurried, practiced patience. Not many drifters handle stock with that particular kind of care. Otis had worked the Foster ranch since before Adeline was born, and his judgment of hired hands had proven reliable enough over the years that her father had rarely questioned it. Adeline valued that same judgment now, though she found herself, in this particular instance, more curious than alarmed by whatever Otis thought he'd noticed. Adeline had filed the observation away without much urgency, the way she filed away most small oddities that did not yet demand an explanation. She had considerably more pressing matters occupying her attention that spring than the private history of one competent hired hand. The roundup went well through the first week, the herd healthy and numerous enough that Adeline allowed herself, for the first time in months, a cautious hope that the autumn settlement might actually be manageable. Jesse proved himself steadily more valuable as the days wore on, catching a case of blackleg in 3 young steers before it could spread through the herd, and working 2 full days without complaint when a sudden spring storm threatened to scatter half their gathered cattle across open range. Adeline found herself in the evenings lingering near the cook fire longer than her own exhaustion strictly warranted, listening to Jesse talk with the other hands about cattle and weather and the particular stubbornness of Nebraska soil. He asked her one evening, plain and direct, about her father, and Adeline found herself telling him considerably more than she'd intended, the particular loneliness of running a ranch alone, finding an unexpected outlet in a stranger's patient attention. She told him about the winter her father taught her to read weather by the particular color of the western sky, and about the first calf she'd delivered herself at 14 while he stood back and let her hands do the learning rather than his own. Jesse listened with a stillness that felt like genuine attention rather than mere politeness, asking small, careful questions that suggested he was building an actual picture of the man rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "You've done well by this place," Jesse said, watching the fire rather than her, the particular careful distance of a man choosing his words with unusual deliberation. "Your father would be proud of what you've kept standing." "Proud isn't going to settle a note come autumn," Adeline said, more sharply than she intended, and immediately regretted the edge in her voice. "No," Jesse agreed quietly. "It won't, but it's worth saying regardless." Franklin Meade rode out to the ranch himself midway through the second week, ostensibly to inspect the herd's condition for the bank's records, though Adeline suspected the visit carried more pointed purpose than he let show directly. He found Jesse working near the corral and paused a long moment, studying him with an expression Adeline could not quite read, before continuing on toward the house without remark. Meade's manner that afternoon struck Adeline as unusually careful, his usual clipped confidence replaced by something closer to weariness, though she attributed it at the time simply to the pressure of overseeing an unusually large debt across a difficult season. She had no reason yet to suspect the weariness had anything at all to do with the quiet hand mending fence near her corral. That evening, Adeline mentioned the odd pause to Jesse directly, curious despite herself. "Meade looked at you like he recognized you," she said. "Have you done business with the Cedar Fork Bank before?" Jesse was quiet a moment longer than the question seemed to warrant. "Passed through this territory once or twice," he said finally, and offered nothing further, the particular closed expression of a man deciding how much truth a question actually deserved. Adeline let the matter drop, though she found herself turning it over more than once in the days that followed. She had learned, running a ranch alone these 2 years, to trust her instincts about people, and her instincts told her, increasingly, that Jesse Dunmore was not entirely the ordinary drifting hand he presented himself to be. The roundup concluded successfully in its 3rd week. The herd gathered, counted, and ready for the drive to the rail depot at Cedar Fork, where the season's cattle prices would be set and the note's fate largely determined. Adeline rode into town herself to confirm the schedule with the depot agent, and found, waiting at the Cedar Fork Cattle Bank's front counter, a commotion that stopped her cold in the doorway. Franklin Meade stood behind his desk, uncharacteristically flustered, addressing a small group of visiting men in dark traveling coats with a deference Adeline had never once seen him extend to anyone. "Mr. Dunmore," Meade was saying, his voice carrying an anxious formality entirely unlike his usual clipped confidence. "We weren't expecting the regional office to send anyone out so soon, sir. I assure you, the Foster note is being handled exactly according to policy." Adeline's breath caught in her chest as she followed Meade's gaze toward the man standing calm and unhurried near the bank's front window, dressed plainly, hat in hand, unmistakably Jesse Dunmore. "Sir," Meade said again, and the word landed in the quiet bank lobby with a weight that rearranged everything Adeline had believed true about the man who had spent 3 weeks mucking her stalls and mending her fences. Jesse turned toward her, and something in his expression, apologetic and steady all at once, told her plainly that whatever explanation existed, it had been a long time coming. "Adeline," he said quietly, "there's a great deal I should have told you before now." She stood frozen in the doorway, the accumulated weight of 3 weeks' small, unexplained oddities finally settling into a shape she could no longer avoid seeing clearly. "Who exactly are you?" she said, though some part of her had already begun assembling the answer from every careful evasion of the past 3 weeks. "Jesse Nathaniel Dunmore," he said plainly, "principal shareholder and managing director of the Omaha Cedar Fork Cattle Bank holding company. Which means, among other things, that Franklin Meade answers to me, and that your father's note has been sitting on my own desk for review since the week I arrived at your ranch asking for work." Adeline felt the ground shift beneath 3 weeks of growing trust in a way that left her genuinely unsteady on her feet. "You've owned my note the whole time," she said. "You mucked my stalls and ate my cooking and let me think you were nothing more than a hired hand, while my whole future was already sitting in your pocket." The visiting men in dark coats shifted uncomfortably nearby, clearly unaccustomed to witnessing their director's private business play out so plainly before an audience, and Meade himself had gone visibly pale, his hands unsteady on the papers before him. Adeline barely registered any of it, her full attention fixed on Jesse, on every small, careful evasion of the past 3 weeks now rearranging itself into a shape that made a terrible, complete kind of sense. "I came to Cedar Fork because our regional reports showed a pattern of unusually aggressive foreclosures across 3 counties, all managed through Meade's office," Jesse said, his voice steady despite the visible strain of the moment. "I needed to understand what was actually happening on the ground before I trusted any manager's paperwork, and I couldn't do that walking in through the front door as the bank's director. Nobody tells a bank owner the truth, Adeline. They tell him what they think he wants to hear. You could have told me," she said, the hurt in her voice sharper than she intended it to be. "Every evening at that fire, every conversation about my father, while you already knew exactly how much danger I was actually in. Every word I said to you was true," Jesse said quietly. "I simply didn't say all of it yet. I understand that doesn't make the hurt smaller, but it isn't the same as having lied to you." Adeline did not answer him further. She turned and walked out of the bank into the bright Cedar Fork afternoon, needing distance more than she needed further explanation, and Jesse let her go without following, understanding, plainly, that some wounds required space before they could properly be tended. She rode home in a haze of anger and confusion that did not fully clear by the time she reached her own gate, and spent the following 2 days in careful, businesslike distance from the ranch hands, though Jesse himself did not return to the bunkhouse at all, having apparently taken a room in town instead. Otis Grady mentioned, carefully, that the whole valley was already talking about the bank owner who'd worked 3 weeks as a common hand, and Adeline found she could not decide whether the growing town gossip made her feel vindicated or simply more exposed. She spent those 2 days turning the whole 3 weeks over in her mind, testing every small kindness against the knowledge that he had possessed the power to end her troubles at any moment, and chosen instead to let her carry them uncertain. She could not decide, some nights, whether that restraint had been wisdom or simply another kind of quiet control, dressed up in humble clothing, and the uncertainty itself became its own particular ache that kept her from sleeping properly either night. It was on the 3rd evening that Franklin Meade himself arrived at her gate, considerably less composed than she had ever seen him, carrying papers he insisted needed her signature before the week's end, regardless of who currently sat above him at the bank. Adeline read the foreclosure notice twice at her kitchen table, understanding, with a cold clarity, that Meade intended to force the matter through before Jesse's review could properly stop him, protecting whatever arrangement had made his aggressive foreclosures so consistently profitable across 3 counties. She rode to town herself the following morning, anger set carefully aside in favor of the more pressing danger Meade's rushed paperwork represented, and found Jesse exactly where the hotel clerk told her he'd be, reviewing ledgers at a corner table with the same careful thoroughness he'd once brought to reading cattle and weather. "I'm still angry," she said, before he could speak first. "I know," Jesse said. "You've every right to be. But Meade's trying to force my foreclosure through before you can properly stop him," Adeline said. "And I expect he's done the same thing to considerably more families than mine, which means this isn't only about my ranch anymore." Jesse's expression sharpened at that, the particular focus of a man recognizing a pattern he had suspected but not yet fully proven. "Show me what you know," he said, and Adeline sat down across from him and laid out everything her own careful records suggested, 3 neighboring ranches that had lost their land to Meade's office in the past year, each one following the same pattern of aggressive terms and rushed timelines that her own note now carried. Together, working through the following days with a thoroughness that slowly began rebuilding something between them neither fully named aloud, they uncovered the fuller shape of Meade's scheme. He had been quietly undervaluing cattle prices in his official reports to the regional office, making struggling ranches appear less viable than their actual roundup returns justified, then pushing those same ranches toward forced sale at prices considerably below fair value to a land syndicate that, Jesse's careful research revealed, Meade himself held a hidden financial interest in. They spent long evenings at the hotel's small corner table, ledgers and reports spread between them, Jesse cross-referencing his own regional records against Adeline's careful roundup tallies, while the town settled into evening quiet around them. Adeline found in that shared labor something considerably more valuable than an apology, the steady daily proof of a man who listened to her judgment and built his own investigation around it rather than simply directing her toward conclusions he'd already reached alone. Adeline's own roundup tallies, meticulously kept across the full 3 weeks of gathering, provided exactly the kind of independent verification the scheme required to unravel, real cattle counts and real market prices standing in direct, undeniable contradiction to the artificially low figures Meade had been reporting to justify his foreclosures. "Your records are the proof," Jesse said, reviewing her careful notebook with genuine admiration. Official reports alone wouldn't convince the regional board. An honest rancher's independent count, cross-referenced against 3 other families' losses, that's considerably harder to dismiss. The confrontation, when it came, happened in the Cedar Fork Cattle Bank's own lobby, Jesse having summoned Meade for what the manager believed was a routine review, only to find Adeline present as well, her roundup ledger laid plainly on the counter between them. Meade's composure cracked visibly as Jesse walked him through the discrepancies one by one, the true cattle counts against the falsified reports, the pattern of foreclosures matching precisely with the syndicate's land purchases. "You've been stealing from every family whose note crossed your desk," Adeline said, her voice carrying clearly through the small crowd that had gathered once word spread through town that something significant was unfolding at the bank. Undervaluing honest work to steal land at half its worth, and calling it sound banking policy the whole while. Meade's protests grew increasingly thin against the accumulated weight of Jesse's authority and Adeline's careful documentation, and within the week, the regional office had removed him from his position entirely, the fraudulent foreclosures reversed, and the 3 affected families restored to their land with proper, honest terms. Adeline's own note was resolved fairly as well, the roundup's true value applied against the balance exactly as it should have been from the start, leaving her with a manageable debt rather than the crushing weight Meade had engineered. Word of the reversal traveled through the valley faster than any single rider could have carried it, the particular way news moves through ranching country where every family's livelihood depends on every neighbor's honesty. The 3 restored families rode out to thank Adeline personally within the week, understanding plainly that her insistence on proof, rather than a quiet private rescue, had protected considerably more than her own ranch alone. Jesse remained in Cedar Fork through the resolution, working alongside the regional board to install a new manager committed to fair, transparent dealing with the valley's ranching families. He made no announcement of grand generosity, no public display of wealth, only steady, visible correction applied consistently to a wrong that had gone unchecked considerably longer than it should have. It was several weeks later, the roundup's proceeds properly settled and Meade's fraud fully unwound, that Jesse rode out to the Foster ranch one evening and found Adeline exactly where he'd first met her, working near the same north corral. "I never needed you to own a bank," she said, before he could speak. "I valued you when I thought you were nothing more than a quiet hand willing to work a hard roundup without complaint." "I know," Jesse said quietly. "That's precisely why I could finally tell you the rest of it." "You'd already decided what you thought of my character before you ever knew what I actually held, and that's worth more to me than anything my own ledgers could prove." He dismounted slowly, giving her time to decide whether she wanted him closer or not, and Adeline found she did not step back the way some careful part of her still expected to. The evening light was going gold across the corral fence, the same particular light that had fallen across this exact spot the afternoon he'd first ridden up asking for work, and something in the symmetry of it settled easier in her chest than she'd expected. Adeline considered him a long moment, the accumulated weight of the past weeks finally settling into something considerably lighter than anger. "The tally book," she said, "the one you kept every evening at the fire. What was actually in it?" Jesse reached into his coat and handed it to her without hesitation, and Adeline opened it to find, not personal accounts at all, but careful notes on every ranch across the valley, fair cattle prices, honest yields, the quiet private record of a man determined to know the truth of his own territory before trusting any manager's convenient paperwork. "Your ranch is in there too," he said, "recorded honestly, same as all the others, from the very first week." She turned the pages slowly, finding her own name near the front, dated the very evening he'd arrived, notes on herd health and fence conditions written in the same careful hand he'd used for every family in the valley. It struck her, reading it, that he had been quietly, faithfully doing right by her from the first evening, long before either of them had any reason to expect the arrangement would become anything more than fair wages honestly earned. She looked up at him, understanding fully now the particular integrity that had guided him through 3 weeks of careful silence. "You could have simply canceled my note the day you arrived," she said, "saved yourself considerable trouble, and saved me 3 weeks of not knowing exactly who I was talking to every evening at that fire. Wouldn't have fixed what Meade was doing to the whole valley," Jesse said. "Would have only saved you and left every other family exposed to the same scheme. I needed the truth proven properly, not simply bought quietly on your behalf alone." Adeline handed the tally book back to him, and something in the gesture settled the last of whatever distance had remained between them since that afternoon in the bank lobby. "I suppose I owe you thanks," she said, "for treating my ranch honestly even while you were deciding whether the rest of this valley deserved the same." "Wasn't deciding anything about you specifically," Jesse said. "Knew within the first week you were exactly what your ledgers eventually proved, honest and capable both. The deciding was all about Meade, and how much rope to give him before I stepped in properly." She smiled at that, the particular smile that costs a person something before it settles into something easy and true. "Well," she said, "you're welcome back in the bunkhouse if you're still willing to muck stalls now that the whole valley knows exactly who you are." "Wouldn't want it any other way," Jesse said, and meant it entirely, understanding that whatever authority he carried in Omaha mattered considerably less to him now than the particular ordinary satisfaction of honest work done well beside a woman who had judged him fairly long before she ever learned what he owned. Adeline turned back toward the corral, and Jesse fell into step beside her, and the whole quiet Nebraska evening settled easy around them both. Otis Grady watched them from the barn doorway a while later, saying nothing to either of them, though he told the other hands afterward that he'd known something was different about Dunmore from that very first week. A man who rode like he'd owned land once, and, as it turned out, had simply been waiting for the right woman to trust him with the truth of it. The Foster ranch prospered in the seasons that followed, its herds healthy, its fences sound, tended now by a rancher's daughter and a bank director who had both, in their own separate ways, learned exactly what honest work was worth when nobody was watching closely enough to notice.